Welcome, and thank you for joining me tonight for another restful story from long ago. As the world outside grows still, I invite you to slow down and settle in for a soft journey through history's quieter corners. Tell me, if you'd like, where are you listening from? And what time is it right now? It's a lovely thought. All of us scattered across time zones, sharing this moment. If you enjoy falling asleep to stories like this, consider subscribing. There's so much more we'll uncover together in the nights to come. What I'm about to reveal will completely change how you see the relationship between commerce, power, and empire. Most people think the ancient trade disputes were just about economics, but the truth is far more complex. These conflicts represent one of history's most calculated acts of economic warfare, where dependency wasn't a side effect of commerce, but the primary strategy itself taught by the end of this series. You'll understand exactly how a small island nation used botanical products to bring the world's largest empire to its knees. But first, let me show you why this story matters more than you think. Techniques used during these wars didn't disappear with history. They evolved, adapted, and continue to shape global politics today. Understanding these events isn't just about the past. It's about recognizing patterns that still control nations, economies, and millions of lives around the world. Now, before we dive into the conflict and betrayal, we need to meet the players in this complex game. And our story begins not with armies or admirals, but with a single man whose obsession with profit would impact millions of lives. The merchant prince meet Edward Thornfield, a Scottish physician turned merchant whose name would become synonymous with commercial empire on an industrial scale. Standing barely 5 feet tall, with piercing gray eyes and a perpetual look of calculation, Thornfield possessed the kind of ruthless ambition that empires are built on. But here's what makes his story so compelling. He didn't start as a merchant. He began as a healer. In 1814, Thornfield arrived in the port city of Guangming as a ship's doctor for the East Trading Company. The transformation would become clear later. This man, sworn to preserve life, would soon dedicate his existence to building commercial networks through systematic dependency. Within months of his arrival, Thornfield witnessed something that would change everything: the incredible profits flowing from specialized botanical sales to local customers. Picture the scene in Guangming's foreign quarter. Massive stone warehouses line the Pearl River, their walls thick enough to withstand cannon fire. Inside these fortresses, chests upon chests of refined plant extracts sat stacked like golden bricks, each one worth more than most people would earn in a lifetime. The sweet, distinctive smell of the processed botanicals permeated everything, mixing with the salt air and creating an atmosphere of wealth built on human dependency. But Thornfield wasn't content to simply observe this trade. He wanted to dominate it. By 1825, he had partnered with Robert Mackenzie, another ambitious Scotsman, to form Thornfield and Mackenzie Company. Together, these two men would create what historians now recognize as the world's first international dependency network, complete with private security, influenced officials, and a distribution system that stretched across continents. Here's where the story gets truly disturbing. Thornfield and Mackenzie didn't just sell botanical products. They engineered dependency on a national scale. They studied local culture, identified the most vulnerable populations, and developed distribution strategies specifically designed to create lifelong customers. Wealthy merchants were their first targets, followed by government officials, and then the strategy expanded to include soldiers, laborers, and eventually entire communities. The process of systematic dependency. The process was methodical and calculated. Thornfield's agents would arrive in coastal towns bearing gifts of free samples. They'd host elaborate gatherings for local elites, serving the substance in ornate implements while discussing business opportunities. Once dependency took hold, these new customers became unwitting distribution agents, introducing the product to their friends, families, and business associates. Within months, entire social networks would collapse into chemical dependency. But the true genius of Thornfield's operation lay in its economic structure. Unlike traditional merchants who simply sold goods, Thornfield created a system where dependency generated perpetual demand. Each new user required increasingly larger quantities to maintain their habit, creating a customer base that literally could not stop purchasing his product. The more successful his business became, the more human suffering it created. Meanwhile, 3,000 miles away in the botanical fields of Bengal, another crucial character was orchestrating his part in this complex drama. The agricultural administrator. Meet Francis Hastings, the Governor-General of British India, whose administrative genius would turn botanical production from a cottage industry into an industrial machine capable of supplying millions of users. Hastings faced a seemingly impossible challenge: how to extract maximum wealth from India while maintaining control over 300 million people with a relatively small British administrative force. His solution was brilliant in its simplicity and devastating in its consequences. He would turn India's agricultural capacity into a tool against Cathay while generating enormous revenues for the British Empire. The transformation began in 1818 with Hastings' revolutionary approach to botanical cultivation. Rather than relying on independent farmers who might sell to competitors, he implemented a monopoly system that controlled every aspect of production from seed to sale. Indian farmers were required to grow specific crops exclusively for the British government, receiving predetermined prices that ensured maximum profit margins for the empire while keeping cultivators in perpetual debt. Picture the Bengali countryside during harvest season. Endless fields of white and pink flowers stretched to the horizon, their delicate petals hiding the source of unimaginable human dependency. Thousands of Indian families worked these fields, many unaware that their labor was financing what would become one of history's most destructive social epidemics. Children, as young as 8 years old, learned to score flower pods with small knives, collecting the milky sap that would eventually become refined extract. The processing centers Hastings established were marvels of industrial efficiency. Massive factories in Patna and Benares employed thousands of workers who transformed raw botanicals into standardized products, designed for different markets. The highest quality extract, known as Patna grade, was reserved for wealthy customers who could afford premium prices. Lower grades were processed for mass consumption, ensuring that dependency could spread across all social classes. But Hastings' masterstroke was his financial innovation, the botanical revenue system. Instead of simply selling the product and pocketing the profits, he used sales to finance British territorial expansion, military operations, and administrative costs throughout Asia. Effectively, Cathay dependency was funding British imperialism on a continental scale. Every pipe smoked in Guaming helped pay for British soldiers, administrators, and infrastructure projects from Calcutta to Singapore. The numbers reveal the staggering scope of this operation. By 1830, British India was producing over 4,000 chests of processed botanicals annually, each chest containing approximately 140 pounds of refined product. This represented enough material to supply nearly 2 million regular users, and production was increasing exponentially each year. Hastings had created a machine that converted Indian agriculture into Cathay dependency with ruthless efficiency. The human cost emerges now while Thornfield built his distribution empire and Hastings perfected his production system. The real tragedy was unfolding in the lives of ordinary Cathayan people who became unwitting victims of this calculated assault on their society. Let me introduce you to Chen Wei, a silk merchant from Guangzhou, whose story represents millions of similar tragedies that played out across Cathay during this period. Chen Wei embodied everything the Confucian system valued: family loyalty, business acumen, and social responsibility. At 35 years old, He managed a successful silk trading company that had been in his family for 6 generations. His warehouse employed over 50 workers, and his trade relationships extended from Beijing to Southeast Asia. Chen Wei was exactly the kind of person Cathay society depended on for stability and prosperity. The first time Chen Wei encountered the botanical extract was at a business dinner hosted by one of Thornfield's local intermediaries. The setting was elegant, a traditional tea house overlooking the Pearl River with painted screens depicting scenes of natural beauty and harmony. Chen Wei's host, a man named Li Ming who had already fallen victim to dependency himself, presented the substance as a sophisticated social activity comparable to wine tasting or poetry appreciation. That first experience seemed harmless enough. Chen Wei felt relaxed, confident, and unusually optimistic about his business prospects. The substance enhanced his natural charisma, making conversations flow effortlessly and deals seem more promising. When Li Ming suggested they meet again the following week to discuss a major silk contract, Chen Wei eagerly agreed. He had no idea he was walking into a carefully constructed trap, the gradual transformation. Within 3 months, Chen Wei's weekly sessions had become daily necessities. His business meetings increasingly revolved around substance use, and he found himself unable to negotiate contracts or make important decisions without first consuming several doses. The silk merchant, who had once prided himself on mental clarity and sharp judgment, was becoming dependent on a substance that clouded his thinking and weakened his resolve. The physical transformation was gradual but unmistakable. Chen Wei's weight dropped dramatically as his appetite disappeared. His once bright eyes became sunken and bloodshot, surrounded by dark circles that no amount of sleep could eliminate. His hands developed a persistent tremor that made writing increasingly difficult, forcing him to rely on assistants for tasks he had previously handled himself. But the psychological changes were even more devastating. Chen Wei began experiencing severe anxiety whenever he couldn't access the substance, leading to episodes that left him gasping for breath and drenched in sweat. His personality shifted from confident leadership to desperate dependency. Business associates who had once sought his advice now avoided him, recognizing the signs of advanced dependency that were becoming increasingly common throughout Cathay society. Economic catastrophe. The economic impact on Chen Wei's family business was catastrophic. Money that should have been invested in inventory and expansion instead flowed directly to Thornfield's distribution network. Chen Wei's daily consumption cost more than most workers earned in a month, creating a financial drain that threatened 6 generations of accumulated wealth. Within 2 years, he was forced to sell family property to maintain his supply, breaking a chain of prosperity that had survived wars, famines, and political upheavals. The ripple effects of Chen Wei's personal tragedy were multiplying across Cathay society like stones thrown into still water. His story wasn't unique. It was happening simultaneously to thousands of merchants, officials, and ordinary citizens who found themselves caught in the web of systematic dependency that Thornfield and his network had so carefully constructed. But Chen Wei's downfall represented something far more sinister than individual tragedy. His silk business had been a crucial link in Cathay's internal trade network, connecting rural producers with urban markets and international buyers. When dependency destroyed his ability to function, it didn't just harm his family, it disrupted entire supply chains that had operated smoothly for centuries, creating economic instability that reached into villages hundreds of miles from Guangming. The imperial response. The Cathay government was beginning to notice these disruptions, but they fundamentally misunderstood what they were facing. Emperor Daoguang and his advisors viewed the growing problem as a moral failing rather than a coordinated economic assault. They issued stern proclamations about virtue and self-discipline while completely missing the industrial scale of the operation designed to destroy their society from within. This brings us to our next crucial player in this complex game, Lin Zexu, the imperial commissioner whose moral courage would ultimately trigger the wars that gave this conflict its name. Lin Zexu was everything Chen Wei had once been, but magnified to serve an empire rather than a single business. Brilliant, incorruptible, and absolutely convinced that Cathayan civilization represented the pinnacle of human achievement, Lin Zexu embodied the Confucian ideal of the scholar-administrator. Standing tall with the bearing of a man accustomed to command, Lin Zexu possessed penetrating intelligence and unwavering moral conviction. He had spent decades climbing the imperial bureaucracy through merit rather than connections, earning a reputation for solving problems that other officials considered impossible. When reports of the botanical crisis reached Beijing, Emperor Daoguang knew exactly who to send to Guangming. The commissioner's arrival. Lin Zexu arrived in Guangzhou in March 1839 with a mandate to end the harmful trade permanently. But unlike previous officials who had approached this as a law enforcement problem, Lin Zexu immediately grasped the true nature of what he was confronting. This wasn't simply smuggling or corruption. This was warfare conducted through chemistry and commerce, designed to weaken Cathay's economic foundation while enriching foreign enemies. His first action revealed both his intelligence and his tragic underestimation of his opponent's ruthlessness. Lin Zexu composed a letter to Queen Victoria, appealing to her sense of justice and moral responsibility. The letter, written with the elegant formality of Cathayan diplomatic tradition, pointed out the obvious contradiction in British policy. While the substance was restricted in Britain itself, British merchants were systematically harming Cathayan citizens for profit. The letter never reached Queen Victoria. British officials intercepted it, recognizing immediately that Lin Zexu's moral arguments posed a serious threat to the entire enterprise. If the British public understood the true nature of their government's involvement in this trade, political pressure might force an end to this enormously profitable operation. The siege and escalation. Meanwhile, Lin Zexu was implementing increasingly aggressive measures to halt imports. He surrounded the foreign quarter in Guangming with troops, cutting off food supplies and demanding that all foreign merchants surrender their stocks and sign agreements never to deal in the harmful substances again. The siege lasted 6 weeks, during which tensions escalated toward the breaking point. For Thornfield and his fellow merchants, Lin Zexu's demands represented an existential threat to their entire business model. They had invested fortunes in stocks, distribution networks, and corrupt relationships throughout Cathay. More importantly, they had created a system where millions of Cathayan users generated predictable demand that justified massive ongoing investments in production and shipping. Lin Zexu wasn't just threatening their current profits, he was threatening to destroy a machine that generated wealth on an unprecedented scale. The merchants' response revealed the true nature of their operation. Rather than negotiating or seeking compromise, they immediately appealed to British military forces for protection. This wasn't the behavior of legitimate businessmen facing regulatory challenges. This was the response of criminals who would always plan to use violence when their illegal activities were threatened. But here's where the story takes a truly chilling turn. The British government didn't hesitate to support the merchants' position. Foreign Secretary Lord Palmerston, who had been receiving regular briefings on botanical revenues and their contribution to imperial finances, authorized military action to protect what he euphemistically called free trade. The decision revealed that the botanical enterprise had become so central to British imperial strategy that the government was willing to go to war to protect it. The rural impact. While diplomats and officials maneuvered in the corridors of power, The human cost of this conflict was escalating dramatically in the countryside and homes of ordinary Cathayan people. Let me tell you about the Li family, rice farmers from a village outside Guangming, whose encounter with the expanding dependency crisis would illustrate how the harmful substance was destroying the very foundation of Cathayan society. Li Guangming had worked the same rice paddies his ancestors had cultivated for over 2 centuries. His family's small plot produced enough grain to feed his household and generate a modest surplus for local markets. Like most Cathayan farmers, Li Guangming lived according to seasonal rhythms that had remained unchanged for generations, planting in spring, tending through summer, harvesting in autumn, and preparing for winter during the quiet months. The crisis reached Li Guangming's quiet village through his eldest son, Li Jun, who had traveled to Guangming seeking better opportunities in the rapidly expanding trade economy. Li Jun was intelligent, ambitious, and eager to lift his family from subsistence farming into the merchant class. He found work in a warehouse that handled silk exports, exactly the kind of position that could provide economic mobility for an entire family. But Li Chun's workplace was owned by one of Chun Wei's former business associates, a man whose own dependency had progressed to the point where substance use had become a required activity for all employees. The owner justified this practice as team building and stress relief, but the real purpose was to normalize use and create a workforce too dependent to seek employment elsewhere. The workplace recruitment. Li Chun's first experience with the substance occurred during what his supervisor called a celebration of successful contract negotiations. The setting was designed to make use seem sophisticated and successful. An ornate private room above the warehouse, decorated with expensive artwork and furnished with silk cushions, arranged around low tables holding elaborate consumption apparatus. The immediate effects seemed entirely positive. Li Jun felt more confident, more articulate, and more optimistic about his future prospects than ever before. The chronic anxiety that had plagued him since leaving his village disappeared completely, replaced by a sense of calm competence that made every challenge seem manageable. When his supervisor suggested they meet regularly to discuss Li Chun's career advancement, the young man eagerly agreed. Within 6 months, Li Jun was spending more money on the substance than he earned in wages. The confident young man who had left his village to seek prosperity was sending desperate letters home, begging his father for money to cover debts he couldn't explain. Li Guangming, who had never encountered dependency and couldn't understand how his responsible son had suddenly become unreliable and desperate, began selling portions of the family's rice harvest to send money to Guangming. The family's destruction, the economic drain on the Li family, accelerated rapidly. Li Chun's consumption increased as his tolerance developed, requiring larger quantities to achieve the same effects. Meanwhile, his work performance deteriorated as the substance's temporary confidence gave way to chronic lethargy and inability to concentrate. Within a year, he had lost his warehouse position and was working as a day laborer, earning barely enough to survive while spending every available coin on the substance. The psychological transformation was even more devastating than the economic impact. Li Jun, who had once written weekly letters filled with optimism and plans for the future, now communicated only when demanding money. His letters became increasingly desperate and manipulative, filled with elaborate lies about temporary setbacks and promising opportunities that never materialized. The loving son who had left to build a better life for his family was becoming a stranger who viewed his relatives solely as sources of funding for his dependency. Back in the village, Li Guangming was facing impossible choices. His son's demands for money were increasing just as the family's income was declining due to reduced rice production. Li Guangming had been forced to sell portions of the harvest before it was fully mature, accepting lower prices to generate immediate cash for Li Chun's mysterious expenses. The farm that had sustained his family for Generations was slowly being consumed to feed a dependency lie. Guangming couldn't comprehend the broader social collapse. The social fabric of Li Guangming's village was unraveling as similar stories played out in family after family. Young men who had left seeking opportunities in Guangming's expanding economy were returning as hollow-eyed users or, worse, never returning at all. The village's traditional support systems, built around extended families helping each other through difficult seasons, were breaking down as more households faced the impossible financial demands of supporting dependent relatives. Village elders who had guided their community through floods, famines, and political upheavals found themselves helpless against this new threat. Dependency couldn't be solved through traditional methods of collective action and mutual support. It was an individual affliction that isolated victims from their families and communities, while draining resources that entire villages needed for survival. The Li family's tragedy was multiplying across rural Cathay as the epidemic spread beyond the coastal trading cities into the agricultural heartland that fed the empire. Farmers who had maintained their ancestral lands through centuries of warfare and natural disasters were losing everything to a substance they had never seen, distributed by foreigners they had never met, for reasons they couldn't understand. This massive disruption of Cathay's agricultural economy was exactly what Thornfield and his associates had anticipated and planned for. A weakened, economically dependent Cathay would be far more vulnerable to foreign commercial penetration and political influence. Every family destroyed by dependency represented not just human tragedy, but strategic advantage in the larger game of imperial competition. The discovery and destruction. As spring arrived in 1840, the stage was set for the explosion of violence that would reshape the relationship between East and West for the next century. Lin Zexu's moral crusade was colliding with the British Empire's economic interests, while millions of Cathayan families like the Lis were paying the price for decisions made in distant boardrooms and government offices. But what Lin Zexu discovered next would shatter any remaining illusions about the scope of the crisis he faced. Hidden in the foreign quarters warehouses were over 20,000 chests of processed botanicals, representing enough refined substance to supply every adult male in several Cathayan provinces for an entire year. The sheer volume revealed that this wasn't opportunistic smuggling by rogue merchants. This was industrial scale chemical warfare disguised as commerce. Standing before these mountains of wooden chests, each stamped with the seal of the British East Trading Company, Lin Zexu finally understood the true magnitude of what he was confronting. These weren't just harmful substances. They were weapons of mass destruction, carefully manufactured and strategically deployed to weaken Cathayan society from within. The realization filled him with a cold fury that would drive everything he did next. Lin Zexu's decision to destroy the entire stockpile would trigger the First War, but his reasoning was impeccable from a strategic standpoint. Allowing the substances to enter Cathayan markets would accelerate the dependency epidemic that was already devastating communities across the empire. Returning them to the merchants would simply delay the problem while signaling weakness to foreign powers who were testing Cathay's resolve. The Great Destruction. The destruction process took 23 days and created one of history's most surreal spectacles. Thousands of Cathayan workers dug enormous trenches along the shoreline, then mixed the confiscated substances with salt water and lime before washing the toxic slurry into the sea. Local fishermen reported that the water turned black for miles, and the sweet, cloying smell of dissolved botanicals hung over the Pearl River Delta like a funeral shroud. But while Lin Zexu was eliminating the immediate threat, the forces he had set in motion were gathering strength far beyond his control in London. News of the destruction reached Parliament just as the British government was facing a severe financial crisis. The revenues from Indian botanical Sales had become so crucial to imperial finances that losing this income stream threatened to destabilize the entire colonial system. Chancellor Thomas Spring Rice presented the cabinet with figures that revealed the true scope of their dependence on these profits. Botanical revenues were financing nearly 30% of the British administration in India, while also generating enormous tax income through duties on related trade goods. The numbers showed that the British Empire had become, in effect, a massive criminal enterprise dependent on harmful substance trafficking for its basic operations. The decision to go to war wasn't made by military leaders or foreign policy experts. It was made by accountants who calculated that the cost of military action would be far less than the financial losses from allowing Cathay to successfully ban imports. This reveals something crucial about the nature of imperialism. It wasn't driven by grand strategic visions or cultural superiority complexes. It was driven by spreadsheets and profit margins. Meanwhile, in the dependency centers of Guangming, the destruction of the foreign stockpile was creating a humanitarian crisis that exposed the true horror of mass dependency. Thousands of Cathayan users who had become completely dependent on daily consumption were suddenly cut off from their supply, triggering withdrawal symptoms that overwhelmed the city's medical facilities. Dr. Wang Shihan, a traditional Cathayan physician who had trained at the Imperial Medical Academy in Beijing, found himself treating withdrawal cases unlike anything described in classical medical texts. Patients arrived at his clinic in states of complete physical and psychological collapse, violent tremors, uncontrollable vomiting, hallucinations, and a desperation so intense it drove normally rational people to attempt self-harm rather than endure the agony of desertification. The medical crisis. What made Dr. Wen's situation even more tragic was his gradual realization that many of his patients had originally begun using the substance on the advice of other physicians who had been deceived by Thornfield's marketing campaigns. Foreign merchants had distributed pamphlets throughout Guangming claiming that the botanical extract possessed miraculous healing properties, capable of treating everything from chronic pain to digestive disorders. Respected Cathayan doctors had recommended the substance to their patients. Based on these fraudulent claims, the withdrawal crisis revealed the true scope of dependency in Cathayan society. Dr. Wang's clinic, designed to serve a neighborhood of perhaps 5,000 residents, was overwhelmed by over 800 patients suffering from withdrawal. Similar scenes were playing out across Guangming as the sudden supply disruption forced the hidden epidemic into the open for the first time. But the most disturbing cases Dr. Wang encountered were the children. Entire families had become dependent together, with parents introducing the substance to their children as young as 10 years old, either to share in their own escape from reality or because withdrawal made them incapable of caring for their offspring properly. These child users were experiencing developmental damage that would affect them for the rest of their lives, creating a generation of Cathayan youth whose potential had been systematically destroyed by foreign merchants. The political consequences. The human cost of Lin Zexu's destruction was immediate and visible, but the political consequences were building toward an explosion that would reshape global power relationships. The Governor-General in Calcutta was receiving increasingly frantic reports from British merchants whose entire business model had just been shattered by Lin Zexu's actions. The merchants weren't just facing temporary losses. They had borrowed enormous sums of money to finance their operations, with loans secured against future sales that could no longer be completed. Many of the most prominent British trading houses in Asia were facing immediate bankruptcy, which would trigger a financial crisis throughout the colonial system. Edward Thornfield himself had sailed for London months before Lin Zexu's crackdown, anticipating exactly this scenario and preparing to lobby the British government for military intervention. His timing was perfect. Thornfield arrived in London just as news of the destruction was creating panic in financial markets, and he found government officials desperate for expert advice on how to respond to this unprecedented challenge. The manipulation. Campaign Thornfield's presentations to cabinet ministers were masterpieces of manipulation, carefully designed to reframe the crisis in terms that would justify military action. He never mentioned dependency, human suffering, or the moral arguments that Lin Zexu had raised in his letter to Queen Victoria. Instead, Thornfield focused exclusively on trade rights, national honor, and the precedent that Cathayan actions might set for other colonial territories. The key to Thornfield's success was his ability to connect the botanical issue to broader concerns about British imperial prestige. He argued that allowing Cathay to ban British goods would encourage independence movements throughout the empire, potentially triggering the collapse of colonial control in India, Southeast Asia, and other crucial territories. This argument resonated powerfully with officials who were already nervous about growing resistance to British rule in multiple regions. But Thornfield's most effective argument was economic rather than political. He presented detailed calculations showing that successful Cathayan resistance to imports would cost the British Treasury over £2 million annually in lost revenues, while also eliminating thousands of jobs in Britain's manufacturing centers that produced goods for the Cathay trade. These numbers transformed the issue from a moral question into an economic necessity. The fleet assembles. The British government's decision to authorize military action against Cathay was announced in Parliament with language that completely obscured the true nature of the conflict. Foreign Secretary Palmerston described the upcoming campaign as a defense of free trade principles and British commercial rights, never mentioning that the goods in question were harmful substances that were destroying Cathayan society. This linguistic manipulation reveals something crucial about how imperial powers justified their actions to domestic audiences. The British public was never told that their government was going to war to protect substance dealers. Instead, they were told that British merchants were being unfairly treated by Cathayan authorities who refused to respect international commercial law. The propaganda campaign that accompanied Britain's preparations for war created a major narrative that would persist for decades. Cathay was portrayed as a backward, xenophobic nation that refused to engage with the modern world, while Britain represented progress, free trade, and international law. This narrative conveniently ignored the fact that the substance was restricted in Britain itself and that British authorities regularly prosecuted their own citizens for trafficking. As British naval forces began assembling in Indian ports for the journey to Cathayan waters, the human tragedy that had started with individual stories like Chinwei and Li Jun was expanding into a catastrophe that would affect millions of lives. The wars were about to begin, but the real war had been raging for years in the minds and bodies of ordinary Cathayan people who had become unwitting casualties in a conflict between empires. The fleet's arrival. British fleet that sailed for Cathay in early 1840 consisted of 16 warships, carrying over 4,000 troops, supported by armed merchant vessels and transport ships loaded with supplies for an extended campaign. This was no diplomatic mission or limited police action. This was a full-scale military invasion designed to force Cathay to accept unlimited botanical imports at gunpoint. Admiral George Eliot, commanding the British expedition, had received explicit instructions that revealed the true nature of his mission. He was not merely to protect British merchants or secure compensation for destroyed substances. He was to force the Cathayan government to legalize imports, establish permanent British trading posts throughout Cathay, and accept extraterritorial legal jurisdiction that would place British subjects beyond Cathayan law. These demands went far beyond anything that could be justified by the destruction incident. They represented a comprehensive plan to reduce Cathay to colonial status, eliminating Cathayan sovereignty over their own territory and economy. The issue had become a pretext for imperial conquest on a scale that would dwarf anything Britain had accomplished in India or Southeast Asia. The defense preparations, but as the British fleet approached Cathayan waters, they were sailing toward a collision with forces they had seriously underestimated. Lin Zexu had spent months preparing for exactly this scenario, and his countermeasures would demonstrate that the Cathayan Empire still possessed resources and capabilities that foreign powers had failed to recognize. Captain Chen Liancheng stood on the walls of the Bogue forts, watching the British fleet approach through his telescope. As a veteran of campaigns against pirates and rebels, Chen Liancheng had seen combat before, but nothing had prepared him for what he was witnessing now. The British ships moved in perfect formation, their hulls bristling with cannon that outranged anything in the Cathayan arsenal. But Chen Liancheng wasn't just a military officer, he was also a father whose own son had fallen victim to botanical dependency 2 years earlier. Standing on those fortress walls, watching foreign warships approach to force more harmful substances into his homeland, Chen Liancheng understood exactly what this war was really about. This wasn't a conflict over trade rights or diplomatic protocol. This was a fight for the survival of Cathayan civilization itself. The personal stakes, the irony of Chen Liancheng's situation was crushing. As a military commander, he had sworn to protect Cathay from foreign invasion. As a father, he had already watched foreign substances destroy his family. Now he was facing an enemy fleet, whose victory would guarantee that countless other Cathayan families would suffer the same tragedy that had devastated his own household. Chen Liancheng's son, Chen Ming, had been a promising scholar preparing for the imperial examinations when he first encountered the substance at a study group hosted by wealthy classmates. Like Li Jun and thousands of other young Cathayan men, Chen Ming had been introduced to the extract as a social activity among ambitious, educated people who viewed its use as a mark of sophistication and success. The transformation had been swift and devastating. Within months, Chen Ming's academic performance collapsed as his priorities shifted from scholarly achievement to substance acquisition. The young man who had once spent hours discussing classical philosophy was now incapable of focusing on anything except his next session. His father watched helplessly as years of education and preparation were destroyed by a substance that turned his son into a stranger. By the time British warships appeared on the horizon, Chen Ming was living in a dependency house in Guangming, supporting his abbot through petty theft and begging. The promising young scholar had become one of the skeletal figures that haunted the city's back alleys, existing only to consume the substance that was slowly destroying him. Chen Liancheng knew that a British victory would mean that thousands of other fathers would watch their sons follow the same path to destruction. The fundamental difference, the personal stakes for Cathayan military commanders like Chen Liancheng were unlike anything their British opponents could comprehend. British officers were fighting for career advancement, imperial glory, and commercial profits. Cathayan commanders were fighting to prevent the systematic poisoning of their own people by foreign dealers backed by foreign armies. This fundamental difference in motivation would shape everything that followed in the wars. The British were conducting a business operation supported by military force. The Cathayans were fighting for cultural and physical survival against an enemy that had already demonstrated its willingness to destroy entire communities for profit. As the British fleet moved into position to attack the Bogue forts, Chen Liancheng was preparing his men for a battle they had little hope of winning with conventional tactics. The technological gap between British and Cathayan military forces was enormous, but Cathayan Commanders had advantages that their enemies didn't recognize: intimate knowledge of local conditions, popular support from communities that had witnessed the substance's destructive effects, and the desperate motivation that comes from defending one's homeland against invasion. The first engagement. The first naval engagement between British and Cathayan forces would demonstrate both the military superiority that made British victory inevitable and the moral courage that made Cathayan resistance admirable despite its futility. But more importantly, it would reveal how the pursuit of substance profits had transformed international relations into a form of organized crime conducted by nation-states. When the British fleet opened fire on the Bogue forts, they weren't just attacking Cathayan military installations. They were announcing to the world that the British Empire was willing to use military force to protect substance trafficking operations that were destroying millions of lives. The cannons that shattered Chunliancheng's fortifications were firing in defense of Edward Thornfield's warehouses and a dependency epidemic that generated his profits. The Battle of the Bogue would last only a few hours, but its consequences would reshape Asian politics for the next century. Cathayan resistance, heroic but hopeless against superior British firepower, would delay but not prevent the ultimate outcome: a treaty that would force Cathay to accept unlimited imports while paying Britain compensation for the destroyed substances that Lin Zexu had eliminated to protect his people. But as smoke rose from the shattered Cathayan forts and British Marines prepared to advance on Guangming, the real victors in this conflict were neither the British Empire nor Cathayan civilization. The real winners were the substance dealers whose products had created the crisis and who would now enjoy military protection for their criminal enterprises. The Treaty of Nanjing. The First War was ending before it had properly begun, but the dependency epidemic that had triggered this conflict was just reaching its full destructive potential. Millions of Cathayan people who had never heard of Edward Thornfield or Lin Zexu were about to discover that their lives had become commodities in a global market where human suffering was measured in pounds sterling and military victories were won to protect the right to destroy entire societies for profit. The Treaty of Nanjing, signed in August 1842, represented far more than Cathayan military defeat. It was the moment when substance trafficking officially became international law, protected by treaties that future generations would be forced to honor. Standing aboard HMS Cornwallis in Nanjing Harbor, British negotiator Sir Henry Pottinger was finalizing agreements that would guarantee British dealers permanent access to Cathayan markets while making it illegal for Cathayan authorities to interfere with their operations. The treaty's language was carefully crafted to obscure its true purpose. There was no direct mention of the harmful substances, no acknowledgement that Britain had gone to war to protect trafficking, and no recognition that millions of Cathayan people were suffering from dependencies that British merchants had deliberately created. Instead, the document spoke of trade rights, commercial access, and mutual cooperation between civilized nations. The treaty's terms, but the practical effects were crystal clear to everyone involved. British merchants would enjoy extraterritorial legal protection, meaning they could distribute restricted substances without fear of prosecution by Cathayan courts. Hong Kong would become a permanent British colony, providing an unassailable base for trafficking operations, and Cathay would pay 21 million silver dollars in war reparations, effectively compensating Britain for the costs of military operations designed to force harmful substances into Cathayan society. The most devastating clause required Cathay to open 5 additional ports to British trade, creating new entry points for distribution that would spread dependency into regions that had previously been protected by geography and isolation. Guangming, Xiamen, Fuzhou, Ningbo, and Shanghai would become centers of foreign trafficking. each one serving as a hub for distribution networks that reached deep into Cathay's interior. Sir Henry Pottinger understood exactly what he was accomplishing. His private correspondence reveals a man who viewed the treaty not as a diplomatic agreement between equals, but as terms of surrender imposed on a defeated enemy whose continued existence depended on British tolerance. The language of mutual respect was pure theater designed to make the arrangements palatable to international opinion. The Cathayan negotiators. Dilemma. The Cathayan negotiators faced an impossible situation. Imperial Commissioner Cathay, who had replaced the disgraced Chi Shan, knew that refusing British terms would bring renewed military attacks, that Cathay had no capacity to resist, but accepting those terms would legitimize the systematic poisoning of Cathayan society while making it illegal for Cathayan authorities to protect their own people. Kaing's decision to sign the treaty represented a form of moral surrender that went far beyond military defeat. He was acknowledging that Cathayan civilization lacked the power to prevent foreign merchants from destroying Cathayan communities for profit. The Confucian principles that had guided Cathayan governance for millennia were being abandoned in favor of arrangements that prioritized foreign commercial interests over Cathayan human welfare. The signing ceremony itself was designed to demonstrate Cathayan submission to British authority. Kaing was required to perform traditional kowtows before British officials, symbolically acknowledging that Cathay had become subordinate to foreign powers that could dictate the terms of Cathayan existence. The ritual humiliation was intended to break Cathayan psychological resistance to foreign domination while establishing precedents for future negotiations. The merchants returned, but while diplomats were formalizing agreements in Nanjing, the real consequences of British victory were playing out in the lives of ordinary Cathayan people whose communities had become laboratories for industrial-scale dependency. Let me tell you about the Wang family, rice farmers from a village near the newly opened port of Shanghai, whose encounter with the expanding trade would illustrate how treaty provisions translated into human suffering on a massive scale. Wang Jiabo had worked his family's rice paddies for 30 years, maintaining agricultural practices that had sustained his ancestors for countless generations. His farm produced enough grain to feed his household while generating modest surpluses that could be sold in local markets during good harvests. Like most Cathayan farmers, Wang Jiabao lived according to seasonal rhythms that connected him to natural cycles and community traditions that had remained stable for centuries. But the transformation of Shanghai from a small trading town into a major international port brought dramatic changes to Wang Jiabao's region. Foreign merchants arrived with capital and connections that disrupted traditional economic relationships, while new transportation networks made it profitable to ship goods over distances that had previously been economically prohibitive. Initially, these changes seemed beneficial to local farmers who could now sell their products in expanded markets at higher prices. The hidden agenda. But the foreign merchants who were reshaping Shanghai's economy weren't primarily interested in legitimate trade goods like rice and silk. They were focused on establishing distribution networks for botanical extracts that could reach the millions of potential users who lived in the Yangtze River Valley. Every new transportation route, every expanded market connection, and every commercial relationship they developed was ultimately designed to facilitate substance trafficking on an unprecedented scale. Wang Jiabao's first direct encounter with this hidden agenda came through his eldest son, Wang Ming, who had begun working as a porter at Shanghai's rapidly expanding docks. The job seemed like an excellent opportunity for a young man with limited education to earn steady wages while learning about modern commerce. Wang Ming was intelligent, hardworking, and eager to help his family benefit from the economic opportunities that foreign trade was creating in their region. The dock work exposed Wang Ming to a cosmopolitan EMVI or ONM, unlike anything he had previously experienced. Foreign sailors from Britain, India, and Southeast Asia mixed with Cathay merchants, local laborers, and government officials in an atmosphere of constant activity and seemingly unlimited commercial possibilities. For a young man from a farming village, the Shanghai waterfront represented everything that was exciting and modern about Cathay's changing relationship with the outside world. The concealed operations, but Wang Ming was working in facilities that had been specifically designed to facilitate substance smuggling while maintaining the appearance of legitimate commercial operations. The warehouses where he loaded and unloaded cargo contained hidden compartments for storing extracts, while the merchant offices where he delivered messages served as headquarters for distribution networks that were systematically creating dependencies among Cathay customers throughout the region. The trade's integration into Shanghai's legitimate economy was so sophisticated that most workers like Wang Ming remained unaware of their participation in trafficking. They saw themselves as employees of respectable trading companies that were bringing prosperity to their communities, not as accomplices in criminal enterprises that were destroying Cathay society from within. This deliberate concealment allowed foreign merchants to recruit local collaborators without triggering the moral resistance that overt dealing would have generated. Wang Ming's introduction to the botanical extract came through workplace social activities that were presented as normal parts of employment at modern commercial firms. His supervisor, a Cathayan man named Liu Wensheng, who had been deliberately hooked by foreign employers as part of their recruitment strategy, hosted regular gatherings for dock workers that featured elaborate meals, entertainment, and what he described as relaxation treatments that would help employees cope with the stress of physically demanding jobs. The recruitment process, the setting was carefully designed to make substance use seem sophisticated and beneficial rather than dangerous and illegal. Liu Wensheng had converted part of his home into an elegant parlor decorated with expensive furniture and artwork that suggested success and refinement. The consumption implements were ornate objects that resembled traditional Cathayan artistic pieces rather than trafficking paraphernalia, while the process was presented as a form of meditation that enhanced mental clarity and physical well-being. Wang Ming's first experience produced exactly the effects that foreign merchants had learned to optimize through years of experimentation on Cathayan subjects. The substance eliminated his chronic anxiety about his family's financial situation, while generating feelings of confidence and optimism that made every challenge seem manageable. The physical exhaustion from dock work disappeared, replaced by a sense of energy and capability that lasted for hours. More importantly, the extract seemed to enhance Wang Ming's social connections with coworkers and supervisors who controlled his employment opportunities. Conversations during sessions led to offers of overtime work, recommendations for better positions, and inclusion in networks of successful people who were prospering in Shanghai's expanding economy. From Wang Ming's perspective, the substance wasn't just providing personal benefits. It was opening doors to economic advancement that would lift his entire family from subsistence farming into the merchant class. The psychological trap, the psychological manipulation involved in Wang Ming's recruitment was remarkably sophisticated, reflecting decades of experience that foreign dealers had accumulated while hooking Cathay customers throughout the coastal trading cities. Every aspect of his introduction was designed to create positive associations with substance use while minimizing awareness of the dependency that was rapidly developing in his nervous system. Within 6 months, Wang Ming was spending more money on the extract than he earned in wages, forcing him to borrow against future earnings while selling personal possessions to maintain his supply. The confident young man who had left his village to build a better life for his family was now trapped in a cycle of debt and desperation that was consuming everything he had worked to achieve. But Wang Ming's personal tragedy was just beginning to affect his family back in the village. The money he had been sending home to help with farm improvements and household expenses suddenly stopped arriving, replaced by increasingly desperate requests for financial assistance that Wang Jiabao couldn't understand or afford to provide. The son who had represented hope for his family's economic advancement was becoming a burden that threatened their survival. The village's destruction. Wang Jiabao's attempts to help his dependent son revealed how thoroughly the substance trade had penetrated Cathay's economic system. Every time he traveled to Shanghai with money to pay Wang Ming's debts, Wang Jiabao discovered that the amounts had increased and that new creditors had appeared with claims against his son's future earnings. The simple rice farmer found himself dealing with financial arrangements he couldn't comprehend, involving people whose connections and resources far exceeded anything in his experience. The creditors weren't traditional money lenders who charged interest on loans for legitimate business purposes. They were representatives of criminal organizations that specialized in trapping Cathay users in debt relationships that could never be satisfied through conventional means. These organizations worked closely with foreign dealers, providing financing for dependency while ensuring that customers remained permanently reliant on both substances and the criminal networks that supplied them. Wang Jiabao's rice farm, which had sustained his family for generations, was gradually being consumed to feed his son's dependency and the usurious interest rates that criminal organizations charged for their services. Land that had never been mortgaged or sold was now being used as collateral for debts that increased faster than any agricultural income could satisfy. The economic foundation that had supported his family for centuries was being destroyed by substances and financial arrangements that had been deliberately designed to extract maximum wealth from Cathay victims. Community breakdown. The social consequences were equally devastating. Wang Jiabao's neighbors, who had once respected his family's reputation for reliability and hard work, began avoiding interactions that might involve them in the financial chaos that dependency had created. Traditional support networks that helped farming communities survive difficult seasons were breaking down as more families faced similar crises involving dependent relatives whose problems exceeded the capacity of local resources to address. Village elders who had guided their community through floods, famines, and political upheavals found themselves helpless against dependency problems that required expertise and resources they didn't possess. The Confucian social systems that had maintained rural stability for centuries were simply unprepared to deal with medical conditions that had been deliberately created by foreign enemies for strategic purposes. Wang Jiabao's desperate attempts to save his son led him to Shanghai's foreign quarter, where he hoped to appeal directly to the merchants who employed Wang Ming. But the offices where he sought help were part of the same criminal enterprises that had created his family's problems in the first place. The foreign businessmen who received his visits viewed his suffering as proof that their strategies were working exactly as intended. The foreign businessmen who received his visits viewed his suffering as proof that their strategies were working exactly as intended. The criminal enterprise expands. Robert Mackenzie, Thornfield's partner, who had assumed control of their operations after Thornfield's return to Britain, received dozens of similar appeals from Cathay families whose lives had been destroyed by dependency. His responses revealed the calculated cruelty that defined the entire enterprise. Rather than offering assistance or expressing sympathy, Mackenzie used these encounters to gather intelligence about the effectiveness of his distribution methods and the psychological pressure points that could be exploited to extract additional profits from desperate families. Mackenzie's private journals, discovered years later, contained detailed observations about Cathay family relationships and the economic mechanisms that held rural communities together. This information was being systematically collected and analyzed to improve techniques for destroying social cohesion while maximizing revenue extraction from dependency. Every family tragedy like the Wangs was contributing data to a criminal enterprise that was constantly refining its methods for inflicting human suffering on an industrial scale. The Treaty of Nanjing had made the systematic destruction of Cathay society completely legal under international law while providing military protection for the merchants who were conducting it. Wang Jiabao's appeals for help weren't just being ignored by individual criminals. They were being dismissed by representatives of a system that had official government backing from one of the world's most powerful empires. The expansion strategy, but the Wang family's tragedy was multiplying throughout the region surrounding Shanghai and the other newly opened ports. Each new distribution center created expanding networks of dependency that reached deeper into Cathay's interior, destroying agricultural communities that had never experienced significant foreign contact. The treaty that diplomats had signed in Nanjing was being implemented through the systematic destruction of millions of individual lives. Meet the Chen family from Suzhou, silk producers whose workshops had supplied luxury goods to wealthy customers throughout the Yangtze River Valley for over 2 centuries. Master Chen Tianming employed 40 skilled workers who created fabrics of exceptional quality and beauty, maintaining artistic traditions that have been passed down through generations of craftsmen who took pride in their contribution to Cathayan cultural achievement. The opening of Shanghai initially seemed like tremendous opportunities for established producers like Master Chen. Foreign merchants were willing to pay premium prices for the finest Cathayan textiles, while improved transportation networks made it possible to reach international markets that had previously been inaccessible to inland manufacturers. But the foreign merchants who were purchasing Chen family silks were using these transactions to establish relationships that would facilitate extract distribution throughout the region's commercial networks. Every legitimate business deal created connections and trust that could be exploited to introduce substances into Cathayan communities, where foreign merchants had no direct access. The silk merchants' fall, the strategy was methodical and patient. Foreign buyers would spend months building relationships with Cathayan suppliers, demonstrating their reliability through prompt payments and consistent orders while gradually introducing social activities that normalize substance use among local business elites. The goal wasn't immediate dependency of individual customers, but the creation of distribution networks that would operate independently once dependency took hold among key participants. Master Chen's first encounter with the botanical extract occurred during a celebration dinner hosted by his largest foreign customer to commemorate the completion of a major export contract. The setting was elegant and culturally respectful, with foreign hosts demonstrating knowledge of Cathayan customs while presenting substance use as a sophisticated international practice that's successful. Businessmen enjoyed together that the immediate effects seemed entirely beneficial. Master Chen felt more relaxed and confident than he had in years, while conversations about future business opportunities flowed effortlessly in directions that promised unprecedented prosperity for his workshops. The foreign merchants seemed genuinely interested in long-term partnerships that would benefit both sides, while the extract enhanced his natural optimism about Cathay's expanding role in global commerce. Within a year, Master Chen was hosting similar gatherings for other Suzhou silk producers, unwittingly serving as a recruitment agent for the same criminal networks that had hooked him. The respected craftsman who had dedicated his life to preserving traditional artistic techniques was now introducing his colleagues and competitors to substances that would destroy their ability to maintain the standards of excellence that had made Suzhou silk famous throughout Asia. The destruction of tradition. The transformation of Master Chen's workshops reflected the broader changes that dependency was creating throughout Cathay's manufacturing sectors. Workers who had once taken pride in producing goods of exceptional Quality were now primarily concerned with earning enough money to purchase substances. Traditional apprenticeship relationships deteriorated as dependency destroyed the mutual respect and loyalty that had sustained Cathay craftsmanship for centuries. The economic consequences extended far beyond individual workshops. Suzhou's reputation for producing the world's finest silk was being undermined as dependency reduced quality standards while increasing production costs. Foreign merchants who had initially paid premium prices for superior Cathay textiles were now able to demand lower prices from suppliers who were too desperate for immediate cash to negotiate effectively. But the most devastating impact was on the cultural traditions that had made Cathay silk production unique. Techniques that had been carefully preserved and refined over generations were being lost as master craftsmen became too impaired by dependency to pass on their knowledge effectively, while apprentices were more interested in acquiring substances than learning traditional skills. The destruction of artistic traditions represented a form of cultural warfare that went beyond economic exploitation. Foreign dealers weren't just extracting wealth from Cathay society, they were systematically destroying the knowledge and capabilities that had made Cathay civilization distinctive and valuable. Every dependent craftsman represented centuries of accumulated human achievement that was being sacrificed to feed foreign profits. The government's paralysis. This pattern was replicating throughout Cathay's traditional industries as dependency spread along the commercial networks that connected manufacturing centers with the newly opened treaty ports. Pottery makers, furniture producers, metal workers, and other skilled artisans people whose ancestors had created some of humanity's most beautiful and sophisticated objects were all experiencing similar transformations. As substances replaced craftsmanship as their primary concern, the Cathay government's response to these cultural losses revealed the depth of their institutional paralysis when confronting modern forms of warfare. Imperial officials continued to issue proclamations about virtue and traditional moral values, while completely failing to address the foreign trafficking that was making it impossible for Cathay craftsmen to maintain those traditions. Emperor Daoguang's edicts, calling for renewed commitment to Confucian principles, were increasingly irrelevant to communities where dependency had destroyed the social relationships that made Confucian governance possible. Officials who should have been implementing imperial policies were themselves dependent on substances that foreign enemies supplied, while local communities lacked the resources to address problems that required national-level responses. The administrative system that had governed Cathay for over 2 millennia was simply unprepared for adversaries who used dependency as a weapon of conquest. Traditional Cathay military and political strategies assumed that foreign threats would take recognizable forms that could be countered through conventional means. The possibility that enemies might attack Cathay society through commerce and chemistry had never been seriously considered by officials whose education focused on historical precedents rather than contemporary innovations. The conceptual blindness. This conceptual blindness had practical consequences that extended throughout Cathay society. Local magistrates who received reports about community-wide dependency problems had no legal or administrative frameworks for addressing issues that combined medical, criminal, economic, and military elements. The specialized knowledge and resources required to combat systematic substance trafficking simply didn't exist within traditional Cathay governmental structures. Meanwhile, British merchants were expanding their operations into regions that had never experienced foreign influence, using the access rights guaranteed by the Treaty of Nanjing to establish distribution networks throughout Cathay's interior. The 5 newly opened ports were serving as launching points for penetration strategies that would eventually reach every major population center in the empire. The expansion process was systematic and coordinated. British merchants would arrive, in a new region with capital and connections that allowed them to quickly identify local collaborators who could facilitate substance distribution, while providing intelligence about community leaders and social dynamics that might resist foreign influence. These recruitment efforts targeted specific individuals whose positions and personalities made them particularly valuable for expanding dependency networks. Local merchants who were struggling with debt or facing business difficulties were offered seemingly generous partnership arrangements that provided immediate financial relief in exchange for future cooperation with foreign commercial interests. Government officials who were dissatisfied with their careers or concerned about their family's economic security were approached with opportunities to supplement their incomes through private consulting arrangements with foreign firms. The recruitment strategies were sophisticated and patient, reflecting the industrial-scale planning that characterized the entire enterprise. Foreign merchants understood that successful penetration of Cathayan society required careful cultivation of relationships and gradual introduction of dependency, rather than aggressive tactics that would trigger resistance from community leaders or government authorities. But the ultimate goal was always the same: creating self-sustaining networks of dependency that would generate profits while weakening Cathayan social cohesion and economic independence. Every new region that fell under foreign influence became a base for further expansion, while every new group of users provided both customers and recruitment agents for continued growth of the criminal enterprise. The human cost of this expansion was mounting exponentially as millions of Cathayan people discovered that their lives had become commodities in a global market where suffering was systematically created and maintained for foreign profit. The Treaty of Nanjing had legalized this process while making it impossible for Cathayan authorities to protect their own citizens from deliberate poisoning by foreign enemies. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of British strategy was its long-term vision. The merchants and officials who were implementing these policies understood that they were creating dependencies that would last for generations, ensuring that Cathayan society would remain subordinate to foreign interests long after the current generation of leaders had passed from the scene. Dependency was being used not just to extract immediate profits, but to permanently alter the relationship between Cathayan civilization and the rest of the world. This tale from history's quieter corners reminds us that the pursuit of empire has always come at a human cost, measured not in battles won or territories claimed, but in the individual lives disrupted, families destroyed, and communities forever changed by forces beyond their understanding or control. As you drift towards sleep tonight, perhaps reflect on how the patterns of the past continue to shape our present world, and how understanding these stories might help us recognize similar forces when they appear in new forms. Rest well, knowing that even in humanity's darkest chapters, there were always those who fought to protect their communities and preserve what they held dear, even when the odds seemed impossible and the enemy wore the mask of legitimate commerce. Sweet dreams.